Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Andrew Lockwood, who is Senior Manager, Analytics and Solution Design at Kenco Group. And today we're going to talk about the great transportation spot market inversion of 2018. Now, a lot of shippers find themselves in a very difficult and costly situation today. Their routing guides are broken, and they're having to reach out to the spot market more often than not to have their loads covered, which is really causing them to pay more than what they had budgeted for this year. So the transportation, the spot market inversion has occurred. But what does that mean for shippers? What action should they take in response? And then what should they do longer term to better prepare themselves for whatever market conditions lie ahead? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to tackle in today's conversation. It's great to have Andrew on the program with us to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Andrew, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me, Adrienne. This is an honor to be on here. First-time caller, long-time listener, so to speak. And, you've done such a good job just in terms of education for the industry. I know I've learned a lot through your website, through email blast, and it's a blast to be here.
Well, great, Andrew. I appreciate the kind words there and feedback. And like you said, your first time, guest here on Talking Logistics. We've had, many of your colleagues on the program, throughout the past few years. But like I always like to do whenever we bring someone new onto the program, I like to find, real briefly how and why they got involved with supply chain logistics to begin with. So before we dive into this whole topic and understand what does this spot market inversion means, why don't you tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Kenco?
Sure. I've been with Kenco for about 5 years now. Started as a project manager on one of our dedicated accounts, and as opportunity would have it, ended up in our transportation group and specifically doing solution design, pricing. I get the opportunity to wear a lot of different hats, which I enjoy. And so this blog post about the spot market inversion was really just an output of what we've seen from just from a general day-to-day standpoint, as well as when you look at the economic conditions as well. So Adrienne, I'm just glad to be able to share that info with really all parties, because it's interesting.
Yeah, no, great. And great role there at Kenco. Now, I noticed you have your bike in the background, so I felt obliged to bring my bike out into the background as well. You and I follow each other on Strava. I know you're big into cycling and I think triathlons as well, right? And I'm big into cycling as well. So we're kind of kindred spirits there on the cycling front.
That's right. But my best ideas happen when I'm on the bike, or at least that's what I like to think. So
yeah, well, absolutely. When you're spending 3, 4, 5, 6 hours on a bike, you've got plenty of time to give some great thought. And of course, there's a lot to think about when it comes to supply chain and logistics. So let's go right into this topic now. Like you mentioned, last month you wrote this blog post that was titled "The Great Transportation Spot Market Inversion of 2018," which it's a great title. It immediately caught my attention because my first question was, what does that mean? Exactly. So that's my first question. What does that mean, and what factors are behind it?
Sure. So technically speaking, one of the metrics we look at is on a monthly basis are the rates that brokers are paying to carriers and the rates that shippers are paying to carriers. So one of the big information sources within the industry is DAT. And so we'll look at their board month to month, and it's a really kind of a good proxy for how the economy is doing, the health of the overall transportation market. And so what we saw in the last part of 2017, where the two lines were trending very closely to one another, and in January, they actually inverted. So what happened is spot rates actually went higher than contract rates, so the rates that shippers can pay to carriers directly. And so I think it's a good point to define what is dedicated, what is this contract rate. So keep in mind, these are the rates paid directly to the carrier. The broker, the carrier rate, doesn't include their margin. And so there's all kinds of different situations. And remember, this is just aggregate data month to month. But what's so wild is that we haven't seen this trend, at least in a very long time, at least as long as I've been in the industry. So for the first time in January, shippers really had better buying power going to carriers directly and negotiating longer term rates than they did through brokers. Now, does that mean that brokerage doesn't have a place? Absolutely not. I think it all depends on who your identity is as a shipper, what your goals are, and conversely, as a carrier, how you respond to this market too is going to be interesting. You know, do you learn some of the lessons of, you know, the last recession coming out of 2008? Or do you get really aggressive in this market? And we can unpack all of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I want to go into some of those questions you just asked there. But what's behind? What do you think is behind that inversion? What are some of the factors that you think caused that to happen?
Well, that's the key word, factors, because there's not really one simple answer to this question. There are things that we've known about for a long time. For example, the driver shortage, and everyone's heard ad nauseum about this. Right now it's at 50K and projected to grow to whatever here in 5 or 10 years. There's the ELD mandate that actually coming up here later this week is now going to be fully enforceable. So right now enforcement can pull a driver over and detain a driver, but they can't find the driver yet. Just from some survey work we've been involved with, we believe that's going to have just maybe a marginal impact to the overall supply of the carrier base across the U.S. But there's other things at work here too. You look at the utilization. There was a blog post by FTR where they reported in February is 97% truck utilization. So what does that mean? That means 97 of the available 100 trucks are being used. In February, as Adrienne, as you know, is relatively, it's supposed to be a slow period of the shipping industry. Not so much. There was, after we saw this spot inversion in January, technically it shifted back in February. But what I would caution is I think the ramifications of this are going to be to the short and intermediate term here before autonomous vehicles hit the road, because you still have only so much supply. It's not like we're adding 5,000 trucks to the road every day. There's so many factors that go into why supply is so constrained. Work-life balance. It's really tough to recruit drivers. As anybody that's watching this recruits drivers knows, there are companies that are literally paying $40,000, $50,000 sign-on bonuses for team drivers just to overpay to get that talent. That's what you have to do now. So, I know we've hit a lot of different areas there, but it's really this confluence of all these factors coming together. And then we haven't even talked about the demand side of the equation. Shippers are just continuing to ship, which is really an output of our robust economy. Most that follow the GDP are saying that we're going to be between a 2 and 3% quarter-over-quarter growth rate for probably the next year and a half at least. Now, that can always change, but the shipments on the road, the demand is really an output of a very healthy economy that we live in, which is great. It's just putting a lot of pressure on the industry, and that's why you see the prices start to escalate to the rate that they have here in the past few months.
Yeah, and I think you hit on some of the key things that I see and hear a lot about, as well. I mean, at the end of the day, many factors on the demand side that are creating, demand for capacity, and many factors on the supply side that are keeping it constrained or kind of keeping, creating this delta between supply and demand, and as a result, you're kind of seeing rise in rates, not only the contracted ones, but also the spot market as well. So what should shippers make out of all this? I mean, how should they interpret this and respond to this inversion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, again, it goes back to your business, who you are, who your core identity is, and who you want to be in the future, as well as just all the internal influences there. In my blog post, I really try to set the stage for making the case for dedicated transportation. Now, it doesn't fit every business model. Let's just assume you're a shipper and you've got all these one-off lanes. The origins and destination points are never really consistently the same. And in that scenario, going through a broker or transportation management provider, 3PL, 4PL type model, that probably helps you get to where you want to be in the long run and try to keep cost in control. But my point is, most businesses, barring a huge profile shift, have consistency in terms of volume, and you can see patterns. You can see kind of an industry term, the matchback, matching the head haul with the back haul, or creating a freight triangle. And that's where I think we're starting to get smarter and realizing, wow, there's all this opportunity if we package this together and we can set the appointment and delivery times to match all of it together. There's really a lot of savings there from a dedicated standpoint. So again, great question. What does this mean for shippers? I would say, one, identify who you want to work with. Adrienne, one thing I love about this industry is really about relationships. That's what attracted me to it, is the ability to serve and provide value for others. And I think it's a really good point in time for shippers to say, what carriers do we get high quality with? Who treats us right? Where do we get both quality and cost at the same time? And so I would say pursue those relationships. If you want to lock in, now's a really good time. Think of it almost like your mortgage rates. Interest rates were so low for a long time. If you wanted to refinance, that was the time to do it before rates continue to go up. The other thing to look at, I think, is internally. If you want to be able to budget and estimate without the fear of rising rates, because I don't want to throw out predictions, but I'm here to say, like, the trends will continue to be prevalent in the next few years. Then if you want to make your life easier budgeting, lock into some type of relationship there. The last piece is, how do you treat carriers at your docks? What's interesting is all these websites popping up. Dock 411 is one of them, where it's visual management for the outside. So carriers going in know that, oh wow, I have a 3-hour wait time at this dock, and so from an outside perspective looking in, is your freight favorable to carriers, or are they getting tied up at your docks, and from a carrier sense, it's not really attractive because they're going to be sitting there for so long.
Yeah, no, the last point kind of brings up, a topic that people always love to talk about when things, when we find ourselves in this environment, is, how do you make yourself, a shipper of choice, right? Or preferred, shipper in the eyes of carriers. I think the point that you brought up in terms of locking in or kind of engaging with those carriers that you've got good trusted relationship with, experience with, and kind of revisiting the routing guide, if you will, kind of engaging in a procurement engagement, I think is what I see more and more shippers to do, to kind of bring their routing guide back to alignment, if you will, with the current market conditions. Because I think what's happening a lot of times is that the reason that a lot of shippers are finding that going to the second, third, fourth carrier, or have to go into the spot market, is that the rates that they have are over a year old, and they're no longer reflective of the current market environment. So I think, to your point, I think I'm seeing more and more shippers trying to say, hey, we need to work, re-engage with our, particularly those strategic carriers and those we have a good relationship with, to kind of realign, our networks and realign our arrangement there. The dedicated piece is interesting, because that one always is, something that I've seen more and more shippers throughout the years start thinking more intelligently about and more strategically about, is to say, hey, where can we, put in, dedicated capacity, where it makes sense. And I think that's where, relative to your title, right, we're doing by looking at your lanes and understanding your network, being able to uncover those opportunities, right?
Yeah, and from the onset, I think most shippers will look at that blog post and they say, well, I'm not sure I want to be locked into a, quote unquote, dedicated relationship. And again, it kind of goes back to the definition of contract rates. To me, there's kind of, within industry, there are different definitions of dedicated. I've got a fleet, I'm going to commit capacity to you as the shipper. But if there's no contract term to that, then it's really kind of you get the first pass on my trucks when they're available. To me, dedicated is really sitting down with, both carrier and shipper and saying, okay, let's put a 3-year or whatever that contract term is out there. And within that agreement, I'm going to give you X number of trucks, X number of trailers, and drivers dedicated to your business. And I think oftentimes from a shipper's perspective, there's a little bit of a hesitation to do that, because you worry about, okay, am I going to get high utilization with these drivers? Am I going to lock myself into something that I wish I had gone to the spot market because it was going to be cheaper? And almost every time when I look at this, Adrienne, especially with our different customer files, it almost always skews out where you get both the cost and the quality element in the end with dedicated. Just like you said, let's just say you have a routing guide. You issue your RFP once a year. It's a big lane rate RFP. By the end of the year, you may be on your fourth, fifth, sixth choice, and your hair's on fire because you're not meeting any of your on-time shipment in full metrics. So it's a long game mindset that I think more and more people are starting to come around to.
Yeah, well, you mentioned on time in full, OTIF, which is something that in the past few months, whenever I've talked to shippers or I've attended conferences, that's top of mind for a lot of shippers out there, particularly those that work with the big retailers that have really put some aggressive metrics around on time in full. So I think that the scales are starting to tip, because I think that quality side of the equation for more progressive shippers is becoming as important, if not more important than the cost side. Cost management is always going to be important. Right. But I think a lot of shippers in this constrained environment say, you know what, we're willing to pay more perhaps, but have that high quality service and be able to meet the more aggressive service expectations of our customers. And I think that's another factor that's kind of driving all of this. So a lot of great recommendations there. But let's flip it around a little bit. And what's the biggest mistake perhaps that a shipper can make in this environment?
Oh, such a good question. I was so glad you asked. The biggest mistake a shipper can make here is really ignoring it. Is saying that no, the market is cyclical, and it is, by the way, but ignoring that rates are going to continue to increase, and that the good old lane rate RFP it's been our bread and butter for 20 years, and that's what we're going to keep doing. And my challenge there to those shippers is to say, hey, look, take a different pragmatic look at your business. Transportation, again, it's an output of volume. Volume always precedes pricing pressures. And if you believe that the American economy is going to continue to grow at the rate that it's been, then you can't ignore this. You just have to adapt to the circumstance. So, to me, and I know that's a blanket statement, just don't ignore it, right? Just look into the data, take a pragmatic look at your business and see where you can find these relationships to balance the cost versus quality equation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, not ignoring it is, it sounds simple, right? But I think there's this tendency to say, hey, we could probably ride this out, or maybe it's not going to be as long lasting as maybe some others might think. But the reality is that the warning signs have been here since at least last summer. Right. And as you talked about earlier, there's so many different signs pointing that the trends are going to continue in the direction that we continue to head in, which is tighter capacity and pressure on rates and so forth. I mean, what about carriers though? I mean, what how should they respond to this? What action should they take? What should their response be?
Yeah, another great question, because it really comes down to what are your goals as a carrier? Let's just use a lesson from history here. Go back 10 years. You saw so many carriers go belly up during the recession, at the end of the recession, because they got overextended with assets. They're overly aggressive on the spot market. And so, when you don't have drivers to fill those trucks, they become lawn ornaments. And then all of a sudden you've got more expense than you've got revenue coming in. It's no good. I think if I were managing a carrier base, here's what I would be looking at is, who do I like doing business with? Who makes my life easy? Am I getting detained at this dock all the time? Because there's really not an ROI when you're just collecting detention fees. So there's that piece of the equation. To me, it's almost like a stock portfolio. Do you want good returns for a longer period of time, or do you want to try to take advantage of the spot market and live with the risk and volatility? And I think that's a question that each carrier has to internally recognize first, and then that precludes how they go to the market in their relationships with shippers. So, here at Kenco, I think we love the long-term relationships. Again, I go back, I say relationships because that's what really attracted me to the business, is people do business with people. And so we want it to work for both parties, and that's always been my my lens to the logistics world. But yeah, I would just caution carriers that get overly aggressive in this market, because eventually we know change is going to happen. Autonomous vehicles, in my head, they're probably 3 to 5 years away. I don't see that technology as ready as perhaps in the airline industry. But once it comes, it's going to be a transformational change. So you've got 3 to 5 years. It's a gold mine if you have a truck. How do you approach it in a way that that balances risk and volatility?
Yeah, no, I think, so really at the end of the day, the recommendations for shippers and carriers is really the same, right? Really focus on those relationships, understand, which of those relationships are really built for the long term and are going to be the one that's going to result in win-win, ultimately for both parties. I mean, you see the same things happening on the shipper side, right? When the pendulum is on their side, there's that temptation to squeeze carriers, as hard as they can to get, more and more cost reductions. And then, you see the ramifications of that because then when the pendulum swings the other way, carriers, they have a long memory. They knew, who beat them up, when times were tough for them. And then now they're, going to look for, freight, their loads elsewhere. I think the other thing that I'm seeing more and more carriers do is, I think to your point, related to that is, putting together shipper scorecards, right? Almost like shippers put carrier scorecards together, just putting shipper scorecards together, saying, which shippers really, get our trucks in and out quickly, pay us on time, all these other, factors, and they're making their business decisions, accordingly, to make sure that they're in, strong, have a strong business foundation so that they can, continue to succeed even when the pendulum swings in the other direction. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but how long do you see this inversion happening or these trends continuing?
Yeah, so if you're like me, you're googling that, spot market inversion or stuff to that degree, and technically in February it's shifted back. So is the right answer to delete this episode? No, I would say actually the ramifications of this are going to last for a while, and here's why. So let's assume that the broker to carrier and contract to carrier rates are the same. Well, again, you're forgetting about that margin there that's going to the broker. Now, brokers, transportation management providers certainly serve a purpose there. There's some value for your business. Again, it just depends what your business model is. And I would say, again, now is going to be a really good time for the foreseeable future. Let's just say for the next year or two, to take a hard look and say, where does it make sense to lock in dedicated contract carriage within our network? If the consistent volumes and patterns are there, it's a slam dunk. Sure, you may be able to save a few pennies through some Excel analysis and say, it makes sense to go to the spot market based on projections from yesterday. But do you want to make your life easy dealing with all the quality issues that are associated with dealing with spot market carriers that you don't know from day to day? So there's that piece. And in my life, I want it to be as easy as possible, know who I'm working with. So, to answer the question, the inversion, even though technically it shifted back, I would take a look at, the March results, which will come out here in a few days. I think the end of first quarter is going to be really interesting. February, there was a temporary relief. And that's why I go back to, there was a little bit of a sigh of relief and a school of thought that, oh, this is past, this is done. And I'd say February is the slowest month, yet based on all these other metrics across the industry, if utilization is this high, imagine what it's going to be like in June and July. I think it's here to stay for a while.
Right. Well, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal just last week, there was a article around, General Mills and Cheerios, makers of Cheerios. I think that Cheerios was in the headline somewhere, but, they reported their financials and, they were talking about how their, freight costs are impacting, profitability. And I think it was the CEO, the CFO, said that their costs are at, levels that they haven't seen in many, many years. So, you're beginning to, when you start hearing CEOs and CFOs, point to freight costs as something that's challenging their ability to meet profit projections, that this is a unique environment, or that it's something that has to be paid attention to. We touched upon this a little bit, but like we said, this market is cyclical. Whether it's a few months from now or a few years from now, ultimately the pendulum will swing in the other direction. I mean, what are some actions that shippers ought to be thinking or doing, from a longer term perspective to really position themselves to succeed no matter what market conditions lie ahead?
Right. The transportation management strategy, I think, is really good for shippers to take a hard look at their business. What matters? In so many cases, I'll hear prospective customers say sometimes, I'll say, well, what makes your product so special in comparison to this, very similar product? And well, our customers, they get their shipments within 2 or 3 days, and our speed to market's what makes it. But I would question that. I say, is that really what differentiates your product? And here's why: because the Amazon effect has conditioned us all to think that things are going to magically show up on our doorstep within 1 to 2 days of us ordering. And so every consumer, when I'm on my computer, I'm thinking through that same lens. Now, what we saw a lot of at the end of last year there were supply and inventory issues, where there were all these quote unquote hot shipments that really weren't hot. If you'd taken a look at your supply and your inventory stores, a month or two ahead and planned a little more conservatively, then you don't get in that pinch where you're shipping stuff in a hot scenario and it's not really hot. I think that's where people, especially a lot of shippers, were getting taken advantage of by carriers, because carriers, like, let's face it, they have all the leverage in the market right now. So we were seeing some crazy rates being thrown at us when we were brokering or managing loads. 400-mile journey at $4 a mile, and you're like, you got to be kidding me. But for a shipper that's in dire straits, that may be their only option. So, I think long-term strategy. What's your inventory strategy? What's your speed to market? Is 6 to 7 days feasible? Is that okay with your consumers? Are you shipping directly to end consumers? Or are you going through a wholesaler or distributor where that lead time doesn't matter as much? I've got a good friend in the CPG business, and we were talking about Walmart's OTIF at 85%. And look, if he misses that 1 day, that's his margin for his load on that truck. So I think strategizing around the true constraints of your business, you're right, Adrienne, like, this is a long-term game. Take a look at that, then manage your transportation around all those constraints.
Yeah, so I guess to paraphrase a little bit there, it seems to me that, from a longer term perspective, I think this is a good opportunity to kind of take a step back and really look at, number one, your distribution and transportation network, right? Is it your current model and design aligned with kind of the current market conditions and what your customer expectations are, or where they're going to be over the next few years? And this might be an opportunity to start making, some changes to the way you flow product, to the way where you keep inventory, how much inventory you keep where. Things like, order working with customers and suppliers with order frequency or order sizes. I mean, it's such a large question that ultimately has an impact on transportation. But I think if you think about it more holistically through that bigger picture lens, I think there might be opportunities from a longer term basis, to really right the ship and align yourself better to, where the future, is pointing toward.
Well, I was going to say, those are the answers to those questions will really lead you to your strategy, because if your business really does depend on your product being at the consumer's doorstep in 2 or 3 days from a location 500 miles away, well, then maybe a dedicated fleet makes sense, because you've got drivers on hand, you can send them, and you're not paying those hot spot market rates. So I think those high level questions, those answers then lead to your strategy.
Yep. Well, Andrew, we're running short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. I mean, as a way to wrap up, if I'm a transportation or supply chain executive, and what should I be communicating to my CFO or CEO of what to expect in terms of, capacity and rates in the months and weeks ahead.
Yeah, it's a tough message because no one wants to go to their CEO and CFO and say, "Hey, the rates are going to be rising." So, sorry. So, the best way I think to go about it is to budget in a conservative manner, taking into account that transportation costs are predicted again to rise either in the mid-single digits up. Some are saying even 10% this year. If you look at metrics like DATS spot rate board year over year, you're seeing things in the mid 20% range. And so you can't get away from that message that the dynamics of the industry is shifting. Prices are increasing. How you deal with it is probably the counter message. So to go back to your last point, things like overall strategy. How does our transportation work within the realm of our business and its focus? So I think you've got to go down those roads. There's so many conversations that can be had through there, but yeah, you've got to be the bearer of bad news. Sorry, but then you can put a plan together to mitigate some of those cost increases as well as lower your risk.
Yeah, no, all good points. I mean, I think the key takeaway and what I hear from a lot of transportation and logistics executives is that it's important to have those ongoing conversations with senior management, senior leadership, in terms of what's happening in the market and keeping them informed. Because at the end of the day, it's better to continually educate the leaders in terms of, even if the news is quote unquote bad news, but at least they're being informed along the way, as opposed to getting hit with unexpectedly with some huge increase or something like that, just because they were caught off guard or really weren't in tune with what was happening in the market. So, ongoing communication, education, it's certainly a critical or a leading practice that I see among, a lot of shippers. Well, Andrew, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface of these topics. And this is certainly a hot topic and one that's going to continue to evolve in the weeks and months ahead. But I appreciate you making the time to be with us today and sharing your insights and perspective and advice on what's happening in the transportation market.
Absolutely. Appreciate what you do again, Adrian. And it's so refreshing to have, a good source of education and some information with what you provide. And thank you for having me on.
Great. Well, again, thank you for being on. And maybe you and I can, find each other at a road race at some point. And I'm sure you'll crush me, but maybe I'll be able to ride with you for the first, mile or two, and then, be on my way.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think it's about time to ride, Adrian. So
there you go. There you go. It's a little bit cool here, and it's still a little bit cold out here. I'm more of a fair weather kind of rider, but hopefully in the next week or two, I'll be able to hit the road myself. I'm currently in the basement with my bike these days. So, but again, thank you for joining us. Those of you that are watching this episode on demand, either on the Kenco website or on the Talking Logistics website. And if you've got a question or comment for Andrew, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.